Before we get into it, like, subscribe, and stay close, because this isn't a love story yet. It's a quiet sentence handed down behind a locked door, the kind that changes a life without making a sound. Rain hammered Montgomery Hall, turning the great windows into shaking sheets of glass and the corridors into a drumbeat of unease. Alexandra. Montgomery was dragged in from the stables still in her riding habit, boots smeared, skirt splattered, hair half unpinned from the morning gallop. She was 22, too sharp to be manageable, too proud to pretend she wasn't angry. The summons had been immediate. No time to change, no time to flatten herself into the soft silhouette her family preferred. The Marquis of Ashford, Charles Montgomery, waited in his study like a man who believed the world only moved when he signed his name. Mahogany desk, heavy ledgers, a fire that did nothing to warm the air. He didn't rise. He didn't soften. He stared at his daughter as if she were an account to be balanced, a problem to be solved, a future to be filed neatly into place. Alexandra knew the rules of their world. She had been taught them stitch by stitch. A lady did not argue, did not shout, did not ride hard enough to come home muddy, did not speak about freedom as if it were something a woman could own. But Alexandra had never been good at pretending the bars of a cage were lace. Her father's decision arrived clean and final, contracts drawn, settlement agreed, wedding in 3 weeks. The name landed like a cold stone. Frederick Hawthorne, Duke of Blackmore. London didn't speak of Blackmore with admiration. It spoke of him like a warning. A widower, reclusive, unforgiving, a man whose grief had hardened into something sharp. Alexandra didn't need society gossip to understand what this meant. She'd watched fear control women for years. He's powerful, so be polite. He's wealthy, so be grateful. Her father wasn't arranging a marriage. He was securing an alliance. He was trading her name and body for influence that would protect his estate, his reputation, his future. The storm outside felt less like weather and more like applause for a decision made without her. She pushed back with a calm that made servants linger near doorways. She called it what it was, a sale. She refused to dress it up as destiny. In response, her father did what men like him always did when a woman named the truth. He called her dramatic, ungrateful. He reminded her of how things work, as if tradition were proof of righteousness. Obedience in his mouth was protection. Then he listed the other men she had refused, like evidence in a trial. Lords with dull eyes and narrower minds. Gentlemen who wanted a wife the way they wanted an heirloom vase, pretty, silent, placed carefully in the right room. Alexandra rejected them because she saw exactly what they offered. A smaller life. A lifetime spent shrinking so a man could feel large. Her father's patience had reached its limit. For years, he had allowed her a little space to run, just enough to keep peace, just enough to avoid scandal. Now the family needed Blackmore, and her freedom was the price. He spoke of law and custom with the confidence of someone who benefited from both. Guardian didn't sound like care, it sounded like ownership. And then the pressure shifted from argument to threat. No inheritance, no home, no support. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply made it clear that society would approve of his cruelty, and that was the sharpest weapon of all. A woman without money, without family protection, without a husband. Society didn't see a person. It saw a warning. Alexandra stood there and realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice. Status over consent. A man's approval over a daughter's future. She didn't cry in the study. She left with her spine straight and her face calm, because dignity was the last thing she could keep when everything else was taken. But once the door closed, the house felt different. The corridors looked the same, yet the air had changed. It wasn't home anymore. It was a waiting room. The days that followed moved. Like a funeral procession dressed in silk. Lady Catherine, her mother, drowned herself in preparations, fabric swatches, invitations, menus, flowers, as if perfection could make reality gentler. Alexandra endured it with a politeness so cold it unsettled everyone around her. Anger was expected. Silence was not. Her mother tried the softer trap. She spoke about security and survival, about how love could be learned over time. It wasn't cruelty in her voice. It was resignation, wisdom forged from limited options. And that resignation hit Alexandra harder than her father's threats. Because her father was easy to hate. Her mother was a mirror. So Alexandra ran to the one place that still felt like hers, the stables, the honest smell of hay and leather, the impatient stomp of hooves. She ordered her favorite mare saddled and rode out in the wrong dress, scandal be damned. For a while, speed made her feel like choice still existed. Wind tore at her face and carried bitterness off her tongue, fields blurred into freedom. But even the fastest, horse tires. Alexandra finally halted on a hill overlooking the estate. Montgomery Hall lay below. Beautiful, proper, suffocating. From up there, the house looked like a painting, balanced, impressive, calm. And that was the trick. A life can be ruined behind perfect windows and still look flawless from the outside. Somewhere inside, seamstresses were measuring silk. Ink was drying on invitations. A future was being built without her permission. Night came. Alexandra returned because her father's power didn't require locks. He only had to decide a door was no longer hers. Inside the house, time became an enemy. Every hour produced another necessary task. A tailor measuring, a jeweler arriving, a servant asking which initials should be embossed on linen. Each small decision carried the same message. This is already decided. People avoided the words that mattered. Not forced, not sold. They used safer language, suitable, advantageous, practical. Her father's authority didn't rely on rage. It relied on certainty. He moved. Through meals and meetings as if nothing had changed, discussing tenets and politics like a man whose conscience was unbothered. That steadiness was its own threat. It told Alexandra he would not reconsider. Alexandra calculated options the way she judged distances on horseback, fast and exact. Flight was not simple. A young woman alone could be stopped with a polite question and a raised eyebrow. Appeal to family was useless. The family benefited. Public shame was a fantasy. Society didn't shame men for controlling daughters. It praised them for it. The system was built so the cage looked like order, and the woman who resisted looked like chaos. The threat of being cut off wasn't only financial. It was social death. Alexandra had watched whispers turn into invitations that stopped arriving, friends turn into strangers, parents turn into wardens. One rumor could erase a woman's future, and everyone would call it her fault. Her father knew that. That was why he didn't need chains. At night, Alexandra lay awake listening to the storm tap at the glass, feeling the walls press in like they were already teaching her what her future would be. Quiet, controlled, and watched. Blackmore's name grew heavier with each day. Servants whispered it like a superstition. Visiting relatives lowered their voices when they mentioned the estate. No proof, only atmosphere, and atmosphere was enough. By the morning of the tea visit, Alexandra's anger cooled into something sharper. Strategy. She decided she would not beg and she would not perform gratitude. She would observe. If the Duke truly was cruel, she would learn the pattern early. If he was simply a man shaped into stone by power and grief, she would find where the stone might crack. Either way, she refused to go in blind. Morning arrived with a new kind of dread. The Duke would come for tea. Not the vows. Just tea. Society's favorite way to pretend something brutal is civilized. Alexandra allowed herself to be dressed in pale pink and arranged into careful ringlets, a picture of obedience that didn't match the person. Inside her skin. She stared at her reflection and felt like she was watching someone else being prepared. Her mother's hands tightened as the maids pinned Alexandra's hair into obedient curls, as if tightness could keep rebellion from spilling out. The dress chosen was soft, pale, harmless, an outfit meant to signal cooperation before Alexandra spoke a single word. Under that fabric, her heartbeat stayed loud, counting down to the moment the front door opened. She felt like she was being packaged, ribboned, and labeled for delivery. At precisely 3 o'clock, the Blackmore carriage rolled into the drive, black lacquer, gold crest, elegance moving with silent confidence. Alexandra watched. From above, as the footman opened the door and a tall figure stepped out, the rumors tried to shape him into a monster. What appeared instead was more dangerous, a man who looked entirely real. Broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, movements controlled, posture rigid with authority. Then he tilted his head, as if sensing he was being watched. Even. From a distance, Alexandra felt the weight of that gaze. Gray as winter, sharp as judgment, not warmth, not welcome, assessment. And in that instant, Alexandra understood the true size of what was coming. Her father wasn't the final gatekeeper anymore. The Duke had arrived to claim what had been promised. The first battle wouldn't be the wedding day. It would be the next few minutes in a room full of manners, where every glance would measure how much of her spirit remained, and whether it would be worth breaking. The Blackmore carriage sat in the drive like a verdict. Black lacquer, gold crest, the kind of elegance that didn't ask permission to be feared. Alexandra watched from upstairs, until her mother's soft urgency finally pulled her away from the window and into motion. The house shifted instantly, servants moving faster, voices lowering, doors closing with more care than usual. Montgomery Hall had hosted nobles before, but this felt different. This wasn't a guest. This was an incoming change of ownership. Alexandra went. Downstairs dressed exactly as her mother intended, pale, composed, harmless on the surface. That presentation didn't soothe her. It irritated her. A soft dress didn't make a hard truth any softer. The pins in her hair felt like tiny restraints. Her reflection had looked like a stranger. Now the hallway mirrors confirmed it from new angles. She moved through the corridor as if walking to a public execution dressed in ribbons. The drawing room had been staged into perfection. Fresh flowers, the best china, silver trays arranged with practiced symmetry. It wasn't hospitality. It was negotiation theater. Everything in the room communicated one thing. This family was ready to perform. Respectability no matter what it cost. Alexandra's father stood near the fireplace like a man waiting to sign the final page of a contract, and beside him, already in the room, was Frederick Hawthorne. Up close, the Duke was not the monster society whispered about. He was worse in a more practical way. He was real. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, every movement controlled as if he'd been trained to waste nothing. No energy, no expression, no warmth. His face carried the hard geometry of aristocracy. Sharp jaw, clean lines, restraint so total it felt engineered. But it was his eyes that changed the air. A storm-gray focus that didn't drift. It measured. It weighed. It decided. Alexandra felt that gaze land on her like a gloved hand. Not curiosity, not admiration, evaluation, as if he were inspecting something expensive that might still disappoint. She lifted her chin on instinct, refusing to shrink into the role the room expected. If this was a transaction, she would not make it easy for anyone to pretend it was anything else. Formalities unfolded the way they always did in places like this, names offered, pleasantries exchanged, polite phrases sliding across the surface like oil. The room sounded normal. That was the sick part. A human life could be redirected forever with the same tone used for discussing weather and hunting. Alexandra watched her father speak about estates and connections as if they were discussing a new carriage. She watched her mother smile too tightly, as if tension could be disguised as charm. She noticed details people missed when they were busy performing. The Duke's hands never fidgeted, his shoulders never softened. He did not scan the room as someone seeking comfort. He scanned it like someone verifying security. He accepted tea like a ritual rather than a pleasure. He ate little. He drank with restraint. He did not fill silence. He allowed silence to exist and forced others to patch it with words. Alexandra realized something quickly. The gossip about him wasn't entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. This wasn't a man who hid because he was weak. This was a man who withdrew because he didn't need anyone's approval. His isolation wasn't a wound, it was a method. Her father tried to steer the moment the way he steered everything, smoothly, strategically, and with lies wrapped in civility. He presented Alexandra as agreeable, eager, looking forward to meeting her future husband. It was an ugly lie delivered with a straight face. Alexandra didn't interrupt immediately. She let the lie sit there, heavy, daring the room to carry it. And when she finally responded, she did it with controlled dryness, the kind of tone that exposed a falsehood without screaming. The Duke noticed. That was the first. Clear sign he was not blind to reality. His attention shifted fully to her, as if he had been waiting for the moment the mask would slip. He didn't scold her. He didn't play along. He went straight to the point in a way that startled even her. He acknowledged she wasn't pleased. That honesty created a crack in the performance. For a second, the room couldn't pretend anymore. Alexandra didn't soften. She escalated because if this was going to be forced, she refused to let it be comfortable. She stated the obvious. No one would be pleased to be traded into marriage with a stranger. Her mother visibly panicked. Her father tightened. But the Duke did something unexpected. He didn't look offended. He looked interested. Not warm, not kind, but engaged. He answered the accusation like a man responding to a legitimate complaint. He didn't deny the arrangement existed. He framed it as mutually beneficial, as if that made it fair. Alexandra recognized the trap. Mutually beneficial meant beneficial to the men making decisions. She didn't let it pass. The consequence of her resistance wasn't immediate violence or shouting. It was something worse in that world, a tightening of control. Her father's presence became sharper, threatening. He demanded apology. He demanded obedience. Alexandra refused to perform remorse for naming the truth. The room went quiet in a way that felt dangerous. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of power deciding how to respond. Then the Duke took control of the situation with a single decisive move. He suggested a walk outside, not as a romantic gesture, as a tactical reset. A way to remove the conversation from the protective crowd of parents and propriety. A way to isolate her without making it look like isolation. Alexandra understood what that meant immediately. She also understood she couldn't refuse without creating an even bigger scandal, and scandal was the one weapon her father would gladly use against her. So she went. A maid followed behind at a proper distance, just close enough to preserve appearances, just far enough to ensure privacy. Outside, the gardens of Montgomery Hall looked flawless. Manicured paths, sculpted hedges, flowers pruned into obedience. Alexandra felt the symbolism like a slap. Even nature was controlled here. Even beauty was forced into shape. The Duke walked with the same deliberate calm he carried indoors. He didn't pretend the tension wasn't there. He didn't offer comfort. He offered truth. The marriage would happen regardless of either of their wishes. That was his first real revelation. He wasn't claiming this as a victory. He spoke as if it were policy, unpleasant, inevitable, already approved. Alexandra pushed back with the only thing she still controlled: language. She refused to call it anything but what it was: a transaction, a purchase, a reduction of her life into a function, bloodline, heirs, social image. She explained what it felt like to be turned into property. She didn't dramatize it, she stated it. The emotion in her voice came from clarity, not hysteria. And for the first time, Frederick Hawthorne revealed something that complicated the narrative. He said he understood, not in a performative, I sympathize way, in a structural way. He claimed he was also a commodity: wealth, title, estate, expectations, lineage. Society demanded an heir from him. Society demanded a wife, a duchess, a functioning household. He spoke as someone trapped in a role built long before he was born. Alexandra wanted to reject that immediately, because it sounded like justification. But the way he said it didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like a confession that he hated the system too, in his own colder way. The difference was that he accepted it, and she refused to. That difference created friction, sharp enough to spark. Alexandra pointed out the obvious. A man could refuse and survive. A woman could refuse and be destroyed. Frederick didn't deny the imbalance. He simply described the consequences in his world: decay of the estate, loss of stability, collapse for people dependent on Blackmore lands. Whether he believed it fully or used it as a shield, it revealed his mindset. Duty wasn't a word he used to decorate himself. It was a weapon he used to cut off anything personal. The argument shifted from marriage to philosophy, heart versus responsibility, freedom versus legacy. Alexandra accused him of being incapable of seeing women as full people. He accused her of never having to carry anything beyond her own desires. Both accusations stung because both were partially true. Alexandra had not been trained to manage an estate. Frederick had not been trained to see beyond hierarchy. They stopped walking, tension thick between them, the maid still trailing behind as a symbol of surveillance. Frederick moved closer, not in intimacy, but in control. He made it explicit that once married, she would have to learn obedience, propriety, the rules of his house. His words didn't come with overt threat, they came with certainty. The certainty of a man who had never been contradicted without consequences. Alexandra felt something cold settle in her stomach. The rumors had made him sound like a beast. The reality was more precise. He was a system in human form. Discipline, expectation, order. A man who believed emotions were noise that disrupted function. But then he asked a question that didn't fit the persona. He asked what she wanted. It was almost worse than any insult, because it forced her to face the truth she had been. Avoiding, she had wants that no one cared to hear. Freedom, choice, a life shaped by her own hands. She couldn't say it out loud without sounding childish in their world. She couldn't speak it without making herself vulnerable. And vulnerability in that garden with that man felt dangerous, so she answered with restraint. She said it didn't matter. What she wanted, because the decision had been made. That was her armor. Fatalism disguised as composure. Frederick accepted it with a nod that wasn't agreement, but acceptance of reality. He stated he would return in 1 week to discuss wedding arrangements, not with her, with her father. That detail landed like a final insult. It confirmed that in his mind, she was not the negotiating party. She was the subject of negotiation. He left her standing among roses trimmed into obedience, and Alexandra watched him walk back toward the house with the controlled pace of a man who believed he had already won. She stood there with trembling hands, not from fear of him alone, but from the dawning realization that she wasn't fighting a villain. She was fighting an entire world that would applaud her defeat. When she returned inside, the house felt even smaller. Her mother's face pleaded for peace. Her father's eyes warned of consequences. Alexandra said little because she understood something new. Every word she spoke would be used to define her. Hysterical, ungrateful, unfit. Silence was not surrender. Silence was planning. That night, she lay awake listening to the storm fade into dripping eaves. The Duke's gray eyes stayed in her mind. The way he looked at her like a responsibility rather than a person. The way he spoke about duty like it could crush anything human. And, worse, the way he admitted he was trapped too, because if that was true, then he wasn't coming to save her. He wasn't even free enough to save himself. By morning, invitations were being drafted. Dressmakers were measuring. The machine moved smoothly. No one asked Alexandra what she wanted because the answer would only complicate the process. And in the middle of that efficiency, Alexandra made a decision of her own. If she could not stop the wedding, she would stop being ignorant. She would learn everything she could about Frederick Hawthorne and Blackmore House, its servants, its rules, its history, its weaknesses, because cages had locks, locks had keys, and somewhere behind the legend of, the Beast of Blackmore, that there had to be something real, something that could be used, not to ruin him, to survive him. And as the first sealed invitations left Montgomery Hall that afternoon, a single thought followed Alexandra like a shadow. The Duke had looked interested when she refused to bend. Not angry, not disgusted. Interested. That meant one of two things. Either he respected a challenge, or he enjoyed breaking it. The wedding arrived with the quiet inevitability of a tide. No drama, no delay. Just a date circled in ink that no one bothered to question anymore. Montgomery Hall woke that morning under a sky the color of dull steel, the kind that threatened rain but never quite delivered it. The weather mirrored the mood perfectly, suspended, heavy, undecided, as if even the heavens were withholding judgment. Alexandra moved through the hours as though separated from herself by glass. Servants dressed her, guided her, adjusted her veil, but none of it felt real. Ivory silk replaced riding boots, gloves covered hands more. Accustomed to reins than ritual. Every step pulled her further from the person she had been and closer to a role already written. No one asked if she was ready. Readiness had never been part of the equation. The ceremony itself unfolded with mechanical precision. Words spoken, vows exchanged, promises made that carried no consent behind them. Alexandra heard her own voice at a distance, calm and clear, answering when expected, moving when directed. She did not cry. Tears would have been interpreted as weakness or regret, and she felt neither. What she felt was something colder. Finality. Frederick Hawthorne stood beside her like a statue carved from discipline. He did not look at her with cruelty or tenderness. He looked forward, focused, as if completing a task. His composure did not falter. His hand did not shake. When he placed the ring on her finger, the gesture was correct, restrained, almost clinical. The kiss that followed was brief and empty, an obligation fulfilled rather than a bond formed. Around them, society exhaled in approval. The transaction was complete. A daughter secured, a duke remarried, an estate stabilized. No one questioned the absence of joy because joy was not required. Stability was. The wedding breakfast blurred into a parade of faces and congratulations Alexandra did not hear. She smiled because it was expected. She curtsied because it was required. Her mother wept softly, though whether from happiness or grief was unclear. Her father wore the expression of a man who had concluded a successful negotiation. The guests praised the elegance, the match, the future. Alexandra watched it all with detached clarity. This was not celebration. It was confirmation. Within the hour, her old life began to move away from her. The Blackmore carriage waited at the drive, dark and imposing, the same symbol of inevitability that had arrived weeks earlier. Montgomery Hall, the place that had once felt confining, now looked almost fragile as she stepped away from it. Familiar windows, familiar stones, a childhood left behind not through growth, but through force. Her mother clung to her at the carriage door, whispering instructions disguised as love, patience, duty, endurance. Her father kissed her forehead, his gesture efficient, restrained, already turning toward the next matter awaiting his attention. Then Alexandra was inside the carriage, the door closing with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. The wheels rolled forward. Montgomery Hall receded into the distance, shrinking until it vanished entirely. Alexandra did not look back again. There was nothing left to negotiate there. The journey to Blackmore House passed in near silence. Frederick spoke only to provide facts, distance, acreage, structure. The estate encompassed thousands of acres, tenant farms, villages, responsibilities. His words painted a picture of scale, not warmth. Alexandra listened, staring out the window as the countryside shifted from gentle fields to something more austere. The land itself seemed to grow heavier, darker, less forgiving. When Blackmore House finally emerged, from the landscape, it did not announce itself gently. It rose from the earth like a monument to endurance, dark stone, towering lines, ancient and immovable. Trees lined the drive, their branches arching overhead in a way that felt less welcoming than watchful. Even in daylight, the house absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Alexandra felt something tighten in her chest. This was not a home built for comfort. This was a structure built to last, to dominate, to remind everyone inside it who held authority. It was beautiful in the way fortresses are beautiful, impressive, intimidating, and utterly indifferent to the people who passed through its gates. The carriage stopped. Servants assembled with precise timing, forming a silent line of expectation. Frederick descended first, already issuing instructions, already absorbed in function. When he offered his hand to Alexandra, she took it because refusing would have accomplished nothing. Gravel crunched beneath her slippers as she stepped down, dozens of eyes tracking her. Movement. The new Duchess of Blackmore had arrived. Introductions followed swiftly. Names, titles, years of service, loyalty declared with rehearsed dignity. The butler spoke of decades served. The housekeeper observed Alexandra with measured assessment, already calculating how this new presence might disrupt the order she maintained. Alexandra responded with courtesy, aware that every expression, every word, was being recorded mentally and weighed. She was shown to her chambers with efficient professionalism. The rooms were vast, too vast. A bed large enough to swallow her whole. Heavy furniture arranged with symmetry rather than comfort. French doors opening onto grounds that stretched beyond sight. Everything spoke of wealth, but none of it spoke of warmth. There was a door connecting her chambers to Frederick's. It remained closed, locked. The symbolism was not subtle. Left alone, Alexandra stood in the center of the room, feeling smaller than she ever had. Not powerless, just displaced. Her trunks arrived. A maid unpacked them, placing familiar items into unfamiliar spaces. Dresses she had chosen were now arranged according to someone else's system. Even her belongings felt absorbed into the house, stripped of context. Frederick did not accompany her. He had estate business, responsibilities, matters that took precedence. He would see her at dinner. The message was clear. The house did not pause for adjustment. Alexandra stepped onto the balcony despite the chill, breathing in the sharp air. From there, the estate unfolded in disciplined layers, gardens giving way to parkland, parkland to forest. Controlled beauty, controlled space. It felt endless and enclosing all at once. When Frederick appeared later, briefly, it was not as a husband seeking intimacy. It was as a man ensuring logistics were intact. He spoke of schedules, of dinner time, of expectations. There was no cruelty in it. There was also no softness. He moved through the space like someone who belonged entirely to it. That night, dinner was served at a table so long it felt absurd for two people. Servants moved silently. Courses arrived and disappeared. Alexandra ate little. The formality created distance where proximity should have existed. The house did not encourage connection. It enforced separation. And yet, beneath that separation, Alexandra began to notice details she hadn't expected. The way Frederick watched the room more than he watched her. The way his posture remained rigid even when seated. The way silence followed him as if it were trained. This was not arrogance alone. This was habit built from years of control. Later, when a storm finally broke outside, rain striking the windows with sudden violence, Alexandra felt the tension shift. The house responded. Footsteps. Movement. Purpose. Frederick rose, citing practical concerns, grounds to be secured, damage to prevent, order to maintain. Without fully understanding why, Alexandra followed. Outside, the storm stripped everything down to essentials. Wind, rain, urgency. The estate became less symbolic and more real. Stones slick with water, paths treacherous, structures vulnerable. Alexandra moved without ceremony, instinct guiding her, helping secure what could be secured. In the chaos, control fractured. For a brief moment, hierarchy dissolved into necessity. Frederick moved with efficiency, but when Alexandra slipped, he caught her without hesitation. The contact was sudden, grounding, human. For a heartbeat, the Duke was not a title or an authority. He was simply a man reacting to prevent harm. And something unexpected happened. They laughed. The sound startled them both. It broke through the tension like a crack in ice. For a fleeting moment, soaked and breathless, they shared something unscripted, something unplanned. It did not erase what had brought them here, but it disrupted the narrative. When they returned inside, dripping water across polished floors, servants fussed, order reasserted itself, and the moment retreated like a dream upon waking. But Alexandra felt its echo linger. Later, wrapped in warmth, sitting alone by the fire, she replayed it. Not the storm, not the danger, but the laughter. The way it had felt unguarded. The way it had momentarily silenced the weight of duty pressing down on both of them. Frederick appeared once more, awkward this time, checking on her condition. His tone lacked command. It carried something unfamiliar, hesitation. He apologized briefly for the chaos. Alexandra dismissed the concern, with honesty rather than courtesy. She was not fragile. She had survived worse than rain. He listened. That alone felt like a shift. When he left, Alexandra remained awake long after the fire burned low. Blackmore House still felt immense, cold, and unforgiving. The marriage was still forced, the future still uncertain, but something subtle had changed. Not enough to call it hope, not enough to trust. Enough to complicate everything. As Alexandra finally lay down in the vast bed that barely felt like hers, one thought refused to leave her mind. The Duke of Blackmore was not the monster she had imagined. And that realization, unsettling and dangerous, made the walls of her new world feel far less predictable than she had expected. The laughter didn't change the facts. Alexandra still woke in Blackmore House as a duchess she never chose to become, under a roof that felt more like a monument than a home. The marriage was still signed into law. The future was still arranged without her consent. But after the storm, something had shifted in the air. Subtle, almost insulting in how small it was, like the first drop of thaw on a frozen lake. Not warmth, not trust, just the uncomfortable sense that the story she told herself about Frederick Hawthorne might not survive reality. Blackmore House returned to its usual discipline the next morning. Servants moved as if the storm had never happened, restoring order with silent efficiency. Shoes polished, rugs brushed, curtains adjusted to precise angles. The estate functioned like a machine that refused to acknowledge chaos. That alone revealed the house's true nature. It didn't comfort. It maintained. Alexandra decided she would not become decoration. If she was trapped here, she would take up space like a person, not like an object. So she started where control lived, routine. She rose early before the household fully stirred. She learned the rhythms. When deliveries arrived, how the kitchens operated, where the ledgers were kept, which servants spoke freely and which ones measured every word. She watched. She asked questions. Not politely, not endlessly, but with the steady insistence of someone who refused to be treated as ornamental. At first, the staff responded with careful caution. They were trained to serve a duchess who smiled and approved and let the housekeeper do everything else. Alexandra was not that duchess. She wanted to see the accounts. She wanted to understand the inventory. She wanted to know which tenant farms struggled and why. Each request was reasonable, yet each one felt disruptive because it didn't match expectation. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, did not resist openly. She did something more strategic. She tested Alexandra. She handed her tasks that most women of that rank would find tedious or beneath them. She provided information with just enough detail to be useful, while watching to see if Alexandra would lose interest the moment the novelty wore off. Alexandra did not lose interest. She moved through the work with a clear mind, absorbing systems the way she once absorbed the map of the countryside on horseback. A household at that scale was not simply a place. It was an institution, money flowing, goods moving, people depending on decisions made in rooms they would never enter. Alexandra began to understand that power wasn't only in titles. It was in knowledge. Whoever understood the machine could steer it. Frederick, for his part, did not interfere. He remained distant but observant, appearing at meals when required and vanishing into estate matters the rest of the day. Their interactions stayed careful, civil, restrained, functional. The storm had not magically softened him. It had merely revealed that softness might exist somewhere beneath the discipline, buried under years of habit. But the more Alexandra involved herself, the more she began to notice the house's peculiar stillness. Blackmore House did not feel merely large. It felt paused, preserved, as if time had stopped and no one had been permitted to touch it since a particular day. It showed in the details. Certain rooms remained closed. Certain corridors felt unused. Portraits were dustless and protected, as if someone ensured they were maintained but never truly lived alongside. Flowers were arranged with formality, never with joy. Even the servants spoke in a slightly lowered tone, as though the walls themselves required reverence. Alexandra began asking quiet questions that didn't sound like interrogation. Small, indirect inquiries. She listened for patterns in responses. She noted which names made people hesitate, which hallways servants avoided when they could, which topics caused Mrs. Blackwood's jaw to tighten for half a second before returning to calm. The answers, when they came, were never direct. They were fragments. The late Duchess. A tragedy. A grief that changed everything. A household that never quite recovered. No one said more than they had to. That secrecy was not accidental. It was enforced. Alexandra had expected Blackmore House to be controlled by Frederick's authority. She had not expected it to be controlled by absence, by something missing that shaped everything around it. A ghost in the structure. Not supernatural, social, emotional. A memory that dictated behavior like law. Frederick did not speak of his first wife unless forced by circumstance, and even then his references were minimal. He did not invite conversation about the past. He tolerated questions like he tolerated the weather, something inevitable, something irritating, something that would pass if endured. So Alexandra shifted approach. Instead of pushing, she observed him. He spent time outside when the weather allowed, walking the grounds with his steward, discussing crops, repairs, rent rolls. He treated the estate like a responsibility that could not be abandoned. When he spoke to staff, he was not cruel. He was precise. Expectation was clear. Mistakes were corrected. Praise was rare, but, when given, specific. He did not socialize for pleasure. He hosted because the role demanded it. He did not smile often. When he did, it was brief, almost involuntary, as if the expression surprised him. Alexandra also noticed what he avoided. He avoided certain rooms. He avoided lingering in public spaces. He kept his private world walled off behind duty. And when silence settled between them at meals, it didn't feel like dislike. It felt like unfamiliarity. Two people forced into proximity without a shared language, trying not to bruise each other while still insisting on boundaries. Despite the tension, a new habit emerged without either of them officially declaring it. They began to share the same spaces more often. It started with practicality. Frederick preferred to review ledgers in the library after dinner. Alexandra preferred quiet to the emptiness of her chambers. She began sitting at the far end of the library with her own papers, studying household accounts, making notes. They did not speak much. They simply existed in the same room without hostility. The silence was different there, less oppressive, more contained. Then came the first real conversation that was not a negotiation. It did not begin with emotion. It began with function. Alexandra asked about tenant farms. Frederick answered with the thoroughness of someone who cared deeply about the matter but refused to make that caring visible. She challenged a detail, politely, firmly, like she would challenge a poor riding path. Frederick corrected her on one point and conceded another. The exchange was sharp but not cruel. And that was the second crack. Because concession from a man like him was rare. It implied respect for competence rather than insistence on dominance. From that day, Alexandra leaned further into the only form of freedom she could still claim: usefulness. If she couldn't control how she arrived at Blackmore House, she could control what she became once inside it. She threw herself into the responsibilities of a duchess not as performance but as strategy. If she had to live in the machine, she would learn every gear. This also changed how the household treated her. Servants began to understand she wasn't a temporary ornament. She was present. She remembered names. She followed up on issues. She asked after people's families. In a way that wasn't performative. That wasn't typical for a woman of her rank. It made her harder to dismiss. But with that increased presence came a consequence Alexandra hadn't fully anticipated. Frederick's attention, quiet and measuring, shifted toward her in a new way. Not romantic, not tender. More like recalibration, as if he had expected a certain type of duchess and was now realizing he had gotten something else entirely. One evening, as they walked the corridors after dinner, routine turning into habit, Alexandra noticed something that had been hiding in plain sight. A door, carefully maintained, with fresh polish on the handle. The kind of door that implied frequent cleaning, yet never frequent entry. She asked a casual question about that wing. Mrs. Blackwood's answer was immediate and closed. The rooms were not used. Alexandra didn't press in that moment, but she felt the warning. The house had boundaries. Even a duchess was expected to respect. Certain topics, certain spaces belonged to the Duke alone. That boundary made Alexandra curious in a way she did not enjoy. Curiosity in that world could be dangerous, but ignoring it felt impossible. Blackmore House was not simply big. It was compartmentalized, sections of life sealed off as if they contained something that could not be disturbed. The more Alexandra learned, the clearer it became that the estate's stillness was not just a side effect of grief, it was maintained deliberately. Someone had decided that the past would remain preserved, untouched, and everyone obeyed that decision without question. Frederick was not simply a widower living quietly. He was a man guarding a memory like a fortress, and Alexandra had started to wonder why. Because grief alone does not require locks, because sorrow alone does not make staff avoid certain corridors, because mourning alone does not turn a house into a museum. On a morning when fog clung to the grounds like a veil, Alexandra asked the steward, carefully, indirectly, about the late Duchess. Not personal details, just the timeline, when she died. How the household shifted afterward. The steward responded with professional caution, but one detail slipped through. The death had been tied to childbirth. A child lost. An heir that never lived. Alexandra already knew in theory that this was a common tragedy, but in Blackmore House it wasn't treated as a tragedy. It was treated as a scar that everyone pretended not to see, yet shaped every decision. The silence around it was too practiced. That night at dinner, Alexandra watched Frederick more closely than she had before. His composure never broke, but she noticed a pattern. When servants served certain dishes, his hands tightened briefly. When the conversation drifted too near family, legacy, his gaze went distant. When the word heir was implied in subtle ways, something hardened in him, as if he were preparing for impact. Alexandra realized the beast reputation wasn't born from cruelty. It was born from coldness, a coldness that protected him from a particular fear. Fear of loss, fear of repeating the past, fear of needing someone and watching them disappear. And here was the problem. Alexandra was beginning to matter to him, even if neither of them named it. Not as love, not as longing, as a presence. A person in the house who wasn't fragile and quiet and easily erased. She argued, she worked, she laughed once in a storm and proved the house could still produce something other than silence. That meant she was becoming a risk. Because if Frederick allowed her in, truly in, then he could lose her too. Alexandra did not know if she was imagining it or reading it accurately. But the more their days settled into shared rhythms, the more she sensed something like an internal battle in him. The Duke wanted order. Alexandra disrupted order by existing honestly. Yet he did not push her away. He simply hovered at the edge of something he refused to name. Then one evening in the library, Alexandra brought up a topic she thought was safe: the house itself. She mentioned how preserved it felt, how certain rooms seemed untouched. She framed it as observation, not accusation. Frederick's response was small but unmistakable. The air in the room tightened, his control sharpened. He did not explain, he did not deny. He simply redirected, effectively closing the subject with a calm that carried weight. And Alexandra understood the message. There were parts of Blackmore House she had not been allowed to see, parts of Frederick Hawthorne he refused to reveal. That refusal became its own discovery. Because men like Frederick did not refuse out of stubbornness alone. They refused when something under the surface was unstable, when touching it might break the structure they had built to survive. Alexandra returned to her chambers that night with a new awareness. This marriage was still an imposed arrangement. The cage still existed. But the bars were not only social, they were psychological. Frederick's grief had built walls as real as stone, and Alexandra, without intending to, was already pressing against them. As she prepared for sleep, she noticed a faint sound in the corridor beyond her. Dour, quiet footsteps, measured, pausing, then moving on. Not servants. Too late, too deliberate. She stepped closer, listening. The sound faded toward the closed wing she'd asked about earlier. Alexandra's pulse quickened, because whatever lived behind those locked rooms was not just memory, it was something the Duke still guarded at night. Alexandra did not sleep well after that night. The sound of footsteps lingered in her mind long after the corridor fell silent, repeating itself with the precision of memory rather than noise. Blackmore House had taught her to listen differently. Silence here was not absence, it was intention. The following days unfolded with an uneasy normality. Breakfasts were shared again, civil and restrained. Estate matters continued. Servants moved with their usual discipline. Frederick remained composed, attentive to duty, outwardly unchanged. And yet Alexandra sensed a tightening beneath the surface, like tension drawn too far and held too long. She noticed it in small things. Frederick began leaving rooms more abruptly. His time in the library shortened. His nightly walks across the grounds became more frequent, longer, always alone. The closed wing remained closed, but Alexandra became increasingly aware of its presence, like a sealed room in the mind that grows louder the longer it is avoided. Alexandra continued her work because work was grounding. Ledgers did not lie. Systems responded to logic. But even numbers could not distract her from the growing sense that Blackmore House was not merely haunted by memory, it was actively structured around it. Decisions made years ago still governed daily life. Servants avoided certain hours, certain staircases. Even Mrs. Blackwood's efficiency faltered near the West Wing, her authority giving way to something like reverence. Alexandra understood then that the past here was not passive. It was preserved, protected, enforced. Her discovery came without warning. It was late afternoon when the headache struck, sudden, sharp, disorienting. Alexandra had been in the library, reviewing correspondence when the light shifted oddly as if the room had tilted. At first she dismissed it as fatigue. She had been working relentlessly, sleeping poorly, thinking too much. But the pain did not fade. It deepened, spreading behind her eyes, dragging her awareness inward. She stood to steady herself and the room slipped. What followed did not feel like imagination. Alexandra was no longer in the library. She was somewhere else. Hot, suffocating, dim. The air was thick with panic and urgency. She felt pain that was not hers, fear that did not originate in her body. She saw hands moving frantically. She heard voices layered with desperation. And above all of it, she felt a crushing helplessness that wrapped around her chest like iron. She understood without explanation. This was not her memory. It was his. Catherine. The name surfaced without effort, as if it had always been waiting. She felt the weight of Frederick's terror, his certainty that something was going wrong and his inability to stop it. She felt the waiting stretch into agony. She felt the moment hope collapsed into loss. Then darkness. Alexandra collapsed. When awareness returned, it was not gently. She gasped as though surfacing from deep water, her body shaking, her heart racing with a fear that did not belong to the present. She was no longer alone. Arms held her upright. The scent of familiar wool and leather anchored her. Frederick's presence surrounded her. Solid, urgent, real. The world reassembled itself slowly. Blackmore House came back into focus. The library shelves, the fire, the sound of her own breathing. But Frederick's face told her everything she needed to know. He had recognized it. Whatever had happened, he understood it immediately, and it terrified him. Alexandra tried to speak, to explain what she had seen, but the effort made her dizzy again. Frederick did not demand answers. He did not question her. He carried her from the library with a control that bordered on restraint, as if he were afraid that if he moved too fast, something would break. Further, he brought her to her chambers and ensured she was settled. A maid was summoned. Water, blankets, quiet. Instructions delivered with clipped precision. Then Frederick left. Not angrily, not cruelly. He left like a man retreating from a fire he could not extinguish. The door closed, and Alexandra felt the absence immediately. That night, passed in fragments. The headache faded, but the memory did not. It stayed vivid, sharp-edged, emotionally intact. Alexandra had not merely witnessed a story, she had inhabited it, felt it from the inside, and that terrified her more than the vision itself. The next morning, Frederick did not appear, nor the next. Meals were sent to Alexandra's chambers with polite explanations. Estate matters continued without interruption. Servants behaved as if nothing unusual had occurred, but Alexandra felt the tension ripple beneath the surface. Frederick Hawthorne was avoiding her, not out of anger, out of fear. That realization hurt more than she expected. Alexandra had not wanted closeness. She had fought against it. But now that a fragile understanding had begun to form, his sudden withdrawal felt like abandonment all over again. Another man choosing control over truth, distance over connection. By the third day, her patience ran out. Alexandra found him in the library, surrounded by ledgers and reports, his posture rigid, his expression closed. He looked exhausted, drawn, like a man who had not slept but refused to admit it. The moment he saw her, his jaw tightened, not with irritation, but with resolve. He tried to dismiss her concern before she could voice it. He framed his absence as necessity, his distance as practicality. Alexandra did not accept it. She named what he was doing. He reacted the way men in power often do when cornered by asserting authority. Titles, boundaries, hierarchy. He reminded her, implicitly, of her place. Alexandra did not retreat. She spoke plainly, cutting through the structure he relied on. She accused him of cowardice, not because he was afraid, but because he refused to face that fear. The word landed hard because it was true. Frederick was not frightened of Alexandra. He was frightened of what she had seen, and of what that meant. When he finally spoke honestly, the control cracked. He admitted that Catherine's death had hollowed him out, that he had carried guilt like a second spine, rigid and unyielding. He believed he had failed her, not abstractly but fundamentally, as a husband, as a protector, as a man who should have foreseen disaster and stopped it through sheer force of will. Alexandra understood then that Frederick did not fear love. He feared responsibility. To love someone meant the possibility of failing them again. To allow Alexandra close meant the possibility that she too could be lost, and that loss would be his fault in the way Catherine's death had become in his mind. Alexandra listened, and in listening, something shifted. Anger softened into understanding, not forgiveness, but clarity. Frederick was not cold because he lacked feeling. He was cold because feeling had once destroyed him. She told him what he could not accept on his own, that Catherine's death was not his crime, that grief had rewritten the story in his head until blame felt safer than randomness, that control was not protection, that shutting himself away did not honor Catherine's memory. It trapped him inside it. Frederick resisted at first, clinging to guilt like armor. Guilt at least gave the illusion of meaning. But Alexandra did not argue emotionally. She dismantled the logic piece by piece, the way she dismantled household inefficiencies, with patience, clarity, and refusal to be intimidated. And then she did something unexpected. She touched him, not romantically, not possessively. She grounded him, physically, forcing him to look at her, not as a symbol, not as a duchess, not as a risk, but as a person standing in front of him, alive, strong, unbroken. She told him she was not Catherine. She told him she was not fragile. She told him that whatever strange connection had allowed her to see that memory did not make her weak. It made avoidance pointless. Frederick broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. The break was internal, a collapse of something he had been holding up for years. His composure fractured, revealing grief that had never been allowed to settle into something survivable. And in that moment, the distance between them vanished. What followed was not planned. It was not strategic. It was not controlled. It was human. The kiss that finally happened was not gentle or polite. It was charged with weeks of tension, with unspoken fear, with attraction neither of them had permitted themselves to acknowledge. It was desperate in the way that comes from restraint snapping all at once. Alexandra felt the truth of it. Immediately, not as romance, but as recognition. This was not a cage tightening. This was a door opening, unexpectedly, dangerously. When they separated, breathless and shaken, nothing was resolved. But nothing could return to what it had been. They did not pretend the past had vanished. Alexandra did not forgive the forced marriage. Frederick did. Not promise transformation. What changed was simpler and far more disruptive. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. From that point on, the marriage was no longer only an obligation. It was a choice being renegotiated in real time. Later that night, alone again, Alexandra replayed the vision. The terror, the loss, the helplessness. But now she understood why it had happened. Not because she was weak, not because Blackmore House was cursed, because grief leaves impressions, and because Frederick had never allowed his to heal. As Alexandra lay awake, the house felt different. Still vast, still imposing, but less sealed, as if something locked away had been acknowledged at last. And acknowledgement alone had altered the structure. In the corridor beyond her door, the night passed without footsteps this time, and that absence felt louder than any sound, because whatever Frederick had been guarding in the dark, he had finally allowed it to be seen. And Alexandra had no idea what the consequences of that would be, for him, for, her, or for the life now unfolding between them. After the line was crossed, the house did not collapse into romance. It tightened into something more dangerous. Possibility. Blackmore House had always run on discipline, quiet schedules, precise routines, a hierarchy so practiced it felt like architecture. That did not change. What changed was the space between Alexandra and Frederick. The distance remained visible to servants and staff, but the tension underneath it shifted from hostility to something less predictable. It was no longer simply two strangers forced into a marriage. It became two people forced to decide what kind of marriage they were going to live inside. The morning after. The confrontation, nothing was announced. There were no apologies made in public, no declarations, no sweeping transformation. Frederick still rose early. The steward still arrived with reports. Mrs. Blackwood still controlled the household with watchful authority. Alexandra still occupied her role with competence rather than softness. The machine continued. But under the surface, the rules had been altered. Frederick did not avoid her anymore. That alone was a change felt everywhere. He appeared at breakfast again, sitting opposite her with a posture that was familiar, but with eyes that were no longer only assessing. He did not speak much at first, as though testing whether silence would wound or comfort. Alexandra refused to fill the gaps with forced charm. She spoke when necessary, and when she did, it was direct, precise, facts, plans, questions. That suited him more than pleasantries ever could. Their conversations regained function first. Farm yields, repairs, the schedule of upcoming obligations, household costs, but function had become a bridge. Where once it had served as a wall, duty used to avoid human proximity, it now forced them into a shared reality. They began to make decisions together in small ways, then in larger ones, and those decisions carried a quiet intimacy no one openly named. Alexandra continued to learn the estate's structure with a determination that unsettled the staff in the beginning and earned their respect over time. She met with the housekeeper regularly, not to assert dominance, but to understand the systems that kept the household stable. She reviewed accounts with the steward, asked about tenant concerns, insisted on seeing the villages rather than hearing about them secondhand. She did not do these things to impress Frederick. She did them because the work created solidity in a life that had been ripped from her control. And yet Frederick watched it with a kind of recalibration that could not be mistaken. It became clear he had never expected a duchess like her. He had expected politeness, obedience, gratitude. Instead, he had acquired a woman who treated the estate like a living organism, who asked questions that exposed weaknesses, who insisted on being useful rather than decorative. It disturbed the order he understood, then slowly improved it. That improvement created another consequence. Frederick began to let her closer to parts of his world he had never meant to share. Not through dramatic gestures, through small permissions, an invitation to review the tenant agreements with him rather than receiving summaries, a request for her opinion on repairs and land management, a willingness to let her sit beside him with ledgers rather than across from him like a distant figure fulfilling formality. Each small step suggested a larger shift. He was no longer treating her as a component in the machine. He was beginning to treat her as a mind. The servants noticed. Not because Frederick acted affectionately, he did not, but because he listened. He allowed Alexandra to challenge him without punishment. He adjusted decisions when her reasoning was better. In a house built on authority, that was startling. It implied he respected her enough to be influenced, and a duke being influenced by a woman was, in itself, a quiet rebellion against the very system that had trapped them. The estate benefited. That was undeniable. But the real change happened at night. In the library after dinner, the air became less guarded. Alexandra found that Frederick, when not performing the duke, had an unusual stillness. He could sit with a book and remain silent for long stretches without discomfort. Alexandra discovered she could do the same. Their silence became shared rather than separate, as if the room itself had become a neutral territory where neither had to fight for control. That is where the discoveries began. Alexandra learned Frederick cared about things he never displayed in public. He watched the sky more than he watched society. He spoke about the stars with a kind of precise fascination, describing them not as romantic symbols but as facts. Patterns, distances, movement. She learned he had built an observatory on the grounds and had not used it in years. Not because he had lost interest, but because grief had made even wonder feel like betrayal. Frederick learned Alexandra carried talents that had been treated as inconveniences in her old life. Her ease with numbers, her ability to interpret patterns quickly, her stubborn insistence that learning was not unfeminine. He discovered she wrote privately, not letters for society, but verses and observations she never meant anyone else to see. The idea that she had an inner world she kept entirely to herself unsettled him. Not because he disliked it, but because it reminded him how little he truly knew about her. As this understanding grew, so did the tension. It was no longer the tension of hostility. It was the tension of proximity. They were still married. They still occupied the same house. They still moved according to roles the world demanded. But the emotional distance that had protected them began to erode in quiet, inconvenient ways. A glance held too long. A pause in conversation that lasted 1 second longer than politeness required. The strange weight of noticing the other person not as an obstacle, but as a presence that affected the room. Alexandra tried to deny it. She told herself competence did not equal affection. She told herself respect did not equal desire. She told herself she was merely adapting to survive. But denial was harder after what had happened in the library, after Frederick's breakdown, after the kiss, after the admission that he had been terrified of losing someone again. There was an uncomfortable truth Alexandra could not ignore anymore. Frederick's fear had not vanished. It had simply changed shape. Instead of avoiding her, he became more careful around her. He watched her as if measuring her strength, looking for signs of fragility, looking for anything that might resemble the past. Alexandra found herself resenting that. She did not want to become a substitute Catherine in his mind. She did not want to become a symbol of redemption or a test of fate. So she decided to force clarity. Not through confrontation, through choice. One evening, after a long day of estate matters, Alexandra walked with Frederick through the gallery corridor, one of the long passages lined with portraits and dark oil paintings. The house was quiet except for distant footsteps of servants settling things for the night. Alexandra's mind returned, as it often did, to the question she could not stop asking. What did it mean to live inside a marriage you did not choose? She did not ask Frederick to apologize again. She did not ask him to promise she would always be safe. She asked something else, something more destabilizing. She made it clear that what had been imposed could not be undone. The marriage existed. The law recognized it. Society would treat them as husband and wife regardless. But there was still one thing they could control, what they made of it. They could live as prisoners sharing walls, or they could make a deliberate decision to become partners. Frederick did not answer quickly. He stopped walking, his face tightening with internal calculation. For him, decisions were not emotional impulses. They were weighed, examined, tested for risk. Alexandra waited, refusing to rescue him with softer words. When he finally responded, it was not poetry. It was truth. He admitted he did not know how to be anything other than what he was. Trained to be. A duke. A man of authority. A man built around distance and control. He admitted that Catherine had never truly known him and that he had never truly known her either. Their marriage had been orderly, correct, and lonely. He admitted that he had married again, not because he was ready, but because the estate demanded it. And because living alone in a house full of memory had slowly become unbearable. Alexandra understood something vital in that confession. Frederick had not chosen her because she was easy. He had chosen her because she was alive in a way he was not. He had seen her once, laughing, arguing, refusing to play the role perfectly, and that life had felt like an antidote to the coldness he lived inside. That revelation could have been romantic. Instead, Alexandra recognized the danger, because it placed expectation on her again. A different kind, but still expectation. Not be obedient, not be quiet, but bring warmth. Chase away darkness. Fix the house. It was not fair. It made her responsible for something she never agreed to carry, so she drew a boundary. She made it clear she would not exist to heal him. She would not exist to redeem the past. She would not exist as a living lantern in a cold corridor. If he wanted partnership, it would have to be real, mutual. Two people choosing to show up without using the other as a tool. Frederick accepted that in a way Alexandra did not expect, not with delight, with relief. As if he had been afraid she would become Catherine in a different disguise, fragile, desperate to please, quietly disappearing behind his needs. Alexandra's resistance reassured him. Her refusal to be used meant she could not be erased the way the past had been erased. From that night, something unspoken became clearer. The marriage was no longer only a structure. It was now a space where choices could happen. They began to do things that made no sense from the outside, but mattered intensely inside the house. Frederick invited Alexandra to the observatory, not as entertainment, but as confession. He showed her charts and instruments, described how he used to spend hours watching the sky because it was one of the few things that did not demand he perform for anyone. The stars did not care if he was a duke. They did not ask him to inherit, produce, impress, or survive grief properly. They simply existed. Alexandra listened, and to her own surprise, she found herself softened, not into submission, but into understanding. She recognized the way his mind worked, structured, disciplined, hungry for certainty because certainty was safer than grief. She recognized that his coldness was not absence of feeling. It was containment. Frederick, in turn, asked Alexandra about her writing. She did not offer it. Easily. She resisted, dismissing it as self-indulgence, calling it flawed, claiming it was not meant to be read. But Frederick insisted in a way that was gentle, not demanding. He did not treat her words as ornamental. He treated them as evidence of her inner life. Eventually, Alexandra brought him a single page. She sat in the library, heart hammering with an anxiety she hated as Frederick read in silence. The room felt too quiet. She nearly snatched the page back out of embarrassment. Then Frederick looked up, and something in his expression shifted. Not desire, not politeness, respect. He told her the writing was good, genuinely good. He pointed out details, imagery, control of rhythm, emotion restrained rather than spilled. He spoke about her work the way he spoke about estates and stars, with seriousness, as if it mattered. That moment changed Alexandra more than she expected. She had been dismissed her entire life as willful, inconvenient, difficult. No one had ever treated her private gifts like something worthy of acknowledgement. Her mother would have encouraged it only if it served marriage prospects. Her father would have mocked it. Frederick treated it as real. And in that recognition, something fragile emerged. Something Alexandra did not want to feel. Because liking him would complicate everything. Because trusting him would make her vulnerable again. And vulnerability was exactly how the world had trapped her in the first place. That night, as they stood too close in the library, Alexandra felt the weight of what had formed between them. Not fantasy, not fairy tale, but something rough and real. Frederick, who had once felt like a jailer, now felt like a man learning how to be human again. Alexandra, who had once felt like a captive, now felt like a person whose mind and presence could reshape the space around her. But the ghost of Catherine still lingered, not as a supernatural thing, but as history. A tragedy that made every step toward intimacy feel like stepping onto thin ice. Frederick's fear returned in subtle ways. He became more attentive to Alexandra's health, watching her too closely when she seemed tired, insisting she rest when she pushed herself too hard. He meant it as care. Alexandra felt it as constraint, so she did something that would have been unthinkable for a woman raised in her world. She demanded the right to be chosen again, not as property, not as duty, as a person. She framed it in the only language Frederick truly respected: action and structure. If he wanted partnership, he should court her properly, not because society required it, but because she required it. Because she deserved the experience of being chosen knowingly, not purchased. Frederick did not laugh. He did not dismiss her. He accepted the challenge. The next day, he did something small but unmistakable. He arranged the day's schedule so they could walk the grounds together without interruption. He didn't make it theatrical. He simply made time. He asked her opinion on matters that were not strictly necessary, small choices that signaled he wanted her input not for efficiency, but for closeness. It wasn't roses and poetry. It was respect expressed through attention. And for Frederick Hawthorne, attention was the rarest currency. As the weeks passed, the house began to respond. The atmosphere shifted. Servants no longer whispered as if holding their breath. Meals became less formal, less like performances, staged for ghosts. Frederick sat nearer at the table. Alexandra found herself laughing more often, not loudly, not carelessly, but genuinely. Even Mrs. Blackwood's rigid posture softened in imperceptible ways, as if she could finally believe Blackmore House might contain a future that was not simply mourning preserved in stone. But then quietly, without ceremony, the first sign of real consequence arrived. It began as fatigue Alexandra could not explain, a heaviness that clung to her even after sleep, a faint nausea in the mornings that she dismissed as stress and change. She had been living under pressure for months. Of course, her body would protest. Until one morning, as she stood near the dressing table, the room shifted again, briefly, and Alexandra's hand flew to her abdomen on instinct. The sensation was not pain. It was certainty, a certainty that froze her in place. Because Alexandra, who had fought against being reduced to a function, who had raged against being valued only for heirs, suddenly realized the house might be about to demand the one thing Frederick feared most, and the one thing she had never been given the right to choose. Alexandra did not speak of the realization immediately. The certainty settled into her quietly, not as panic, but as weight, a shift in balance, a truth too large to name before she understood what it would demand of her. Blackmore. House had taught her caution, and now caution became instinct. She observed her body the way she had learned to observe the estate, looking for patterns, confirming signs, refusing to act on impulse. The signs did not fade. They sharpened. Days passed, then another week, and the fatigue deepened rather than lifted. Mornings brought a faint nausea she could no longer dismiss. Certain scents turned unbearable. Certain foods lost all appeal. Alexandra, who had always trusted her body as a tool of strength, recognized what was happening long before anyone else would have dared suggest it. She was with child. The knowledge did not arrive with joy. It arrived with consequence. Alexandra understood immediately what this meant inside Blackmore House. Pregnancy was not a private condition here. It was a political fact. An heir was not simply a child. It was stability, continuity, legacy. The thing Frederick had been trained since birth to protect. The thing that had already destroyed him once. For days, Alexandra carried the truth. Alone. She continued her work. She attended meals. She spoke to Frederick as she always had, watching him carefully. And as she watched, she saw the danger more clearly than ever. Frederick was calmer now, more present, more human. But that humanity had only been possible because he believed he could still control outcomes. Because he believed Tragedy would not repeat itself if he was vigilant enough. This knowledge would shatter that illusion. Alexandra delayed not out of fear, but out of responsibility. She would not drop this truth into the room like a weapon. She would not allow it to become another thing that happened to Frederick without preparation. She had spent her life being acted upon. She would not repeat that pattern now. When she finally told him, she chose the setting deliberately. Not the dining room, not the study, the observatory, the one place Frederick allowed himself to exist without armor. The stars were visible that night, clear, distant, indifferent. Alexandra stood beside him among the instruments and charts, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. Frederick noticed the tension immediately. He always did now. He turned toward her with concern rather than command. Alexandra did not dramatize it. She stated the fact plainly. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Frederick did not shout. He did not deny it. He went still in a way that told Alexandra everything she needed to know. His breath caught. His hands tightened against the edge of the table. The past surged up in him with violent clarity, not memory, but anticipation. Fear did not creep in. It flooded. Alexandra watched the man she had come to know fracture under the weight of inevitability. His first instinct was control. Questions followed in rapid succession: medical, logistical, preventative. He spoke about physicians, schedules, restrictions. He spoke about risk as if naming it might contain it. He spoke about safety in a way that felt less like care and more like desperation. Alexandra stopped him. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She grounded him the same way she had before, by refusing to let fear dictate reality. She reminded him of what he had learned, of what they had built. She reminded him that Catherine's death was not prophecy, that history did not repeat itself simply because it existed. Frederick struggled against that truth. Guilt does not release its hold easily. Fear, once proven, does not respond to logic. Alexandra saw him retreating inward, preparing himself to endure loss before it could occur. And this time, she refused to let him. Alexandra made something clear with a firmness that left no room for misinterpretation. She was not fragile. She would not be hidden away. She would not be reduced to a vessel to be guarded into silence. She would not live her pregnancy as a prelude to mourning. She told him she would choose how this unfolded, just as she had chosen how their marriage would unfold after the line was crossed. Frederick could support her, or he could watch her do it alone, but fear would not be allowed to lead. That was, the moment the final transformation began. Frederick did not stop being afraid, but he learned to place fear behind trust. He stayed close without suffocating. He listened when Alexandra set boundaries. He learned to distinguish between protection and possession. It was not perfect. He faltered. He hovered. But each time Alexandra corrected the course, not with softness, but with clarity. The household noticed immediately. Blackmore House, which had been preserved in stillness for years, began to move forward again. Rooms long closed were opened for light and air. Menus changed, schedules adjusted. Mrs. Blackwood, who had ruled through order and memory, now ruled through preparation and cautious optimism. Servants spoke of the future without lowering their voices. The pregnancy progressed steadily. Alexandra remained active, refusing to retreat into passivity. She continued managing the estate alongside Frederick, visiting villages, reviewing plans, insisting on involvement. She refused to let pregnancy erase her identity. And Frederick, despite every instinct urging him to restrain her, learned to trust her judgment. That trust changed him. He began to sleep better. He returned to the observatory regularly, not to escape, but to share. He spoke more openly about the past, not reliving it, but placing it where it belonged. The ghost of Catherine did not disappear, but it stopped controlling the house. Her memory became history rather than law. When Alexandra's time came, Blackmore House did not close in on itself the way it had years before. It prepared. Frederick defied convention without hesitation. He remained present throughout the labor, ignoring tradition, ignoring whispers. He stayed because leaving was no longer an option he accepted. Alexandra faced the ordeal with the same resolve she had shown since the beginning, aware of risk, unwilling to be ruled by it. The outcome was decisive. The child survived. Alexandra survived. When the crying finally filled the room, it cut through years of silence like a blade. Not fragile sound, alive sound, proof. Frederick broke then, not from fear, but from release. The weight he had carried since Catherine's death fell away in a single, overwhelming moment. He held his wife and their child with a reverence that was not ownership, not triumph, but gratitude. They named their daughter with intention, not as replacement, not as erasure, but as continuation, without repetition. Hope Catherine Hawthorne. The name mattered, because hope was not blind optimism here. It was something earned, something built deliberately after destruction. Alexandra recovered quickly, as she had insisted she would. Strength returned to her body and clarity returned to her mind. She did not allow motherhood to erase her. Agency any more than she had allowed marriage to. Frederick supported that fully now, not because he had been convinced, but because he had seen the result of trusting her. Blackmore House changed permanently. The long table in the dining room was used less often. Meals became smaller, warmer, more human. Laughter, real laughter, echoed in corridors that had once preserved only footsteps and restraint. Servants no longer treated silence as reverence. They treated it as optional. The estate prospered, not just financially, but culturally. Decisions were made collaboratively. The Duke of Blackmore was still a figure of authority, but now he ruled alongside a woman who had never been meant to rule. At all. Alexandra never forgot how she arrived there. She did not romanticize her captivity. She did not forgive the system that had sold her into marriage. She did not pretend autonomy had been granted rather than seized. What changed was not the past. It was the outcome. She had taken a structure designed to confine her and reshaped it through refusal, intelligence, and choice. Frederick never forgot it either. He understood finally that love was not obedience, not gratitude, not sacrifice performed in silence. Love was partnership under pressure, respect maintained even when fear demanded control, presence without possession. Together they raised their daughter with a truth neither of them had been taught as children, that duty without humanity is cruelty, and tradition without choice is violence dressed in ceremony. Blackmore House, once a tomb of preserved grief, became a home defined by motion, not perfection, not ease, but life. And in the end, Alexandra Montgomery, once sold as property, once stripped of choice, stood at the center of it all, not as a duchess first, not as a wife first, not as a mother first, but as herself, still unyielding, still thinking, still choosing. And that, more than legacy or title or bloodline, became the true inheritance of Blackmore House.